Hey, it's your pal Mike Shea here with another episode, a long time coming episode of the DM's Deep Dive. Today, I am here with my friend Dave Chalker. Dave, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dave Chalker. I'm a gamer, a game designer of the both RPG and board game varieties. Longtime D&D player. You and I have played a bunch of various D&D editions together of various states, and yeah, that's who I am. And I guess I should say I founded and run Critical Hits the blog, which is how we met up, and
Yep.
uh, part of this topic as well as a lot of ink spilled on our respective vlogs about this topic.
I don't know that I've ever really. I mean, and I actually had the opportunity to write for Critical Hits back in the 4E days. I wrote one of my favorite articles that I ever wrote about things I learned running a 1 to 30 campaign
Mhm.
in fourth edition, which I still
Good
go
one.
back to now. Like I still go back and kind of, how did I feel about it? Because it's so easy to like feel about it now and then say like, well, that was 6 years ago. Like,
Right.
how do I feel about it at the time? So tonight, we wanted to talk about specifically the different styles of combat that can occur in D&D. That's kind of a fuzzy way of saying it, but if you say like, well, we wanted to talk about gridded combat versus theater of the mind, it's like, well, that's actually a false dichotomy because
Yes.
there are actually many different ways to kind of run combat. And we're talking about D&D, but we're going to go off into all different RPGs and how other groups do it. But kind of with that focus back of how does that change how D&D does it, or how can it, right? How does it
Mhm.
affect D&D? But yeah, there's a lot of variety. So the fuzzier title of combat styles of D&D is sort of the best I could come up with that sort of captured all of these different styles of combat. But if you're thinking theater of the mind, gridded combat, abstract zone-based combat like Fate has, abstract distances like 13th Age has, and I'm sure there are
Mhm.
more. And you have more experience in this than I do, so I'm curious of like what else are we missing in that group. But when we do the deep dive, one of the things I like to do is offer some specific things to the people that watch in as early amount of time as possible in the show. So I'd like to ask you. I'll answer for myself, but we'll start with you. What is your preferred style of combat in D&D or in other RPGs? And what tips do you have for people to run combat in that style? What 3 tips specifically?
Yeah. Three tips. Okay. So I would say I run usually closer to gridded combat in D&D. Um not I don't like the strict grid anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but and again, you brought up some of the like things that might be in the middle, but I would say it's closer to gridded, but not where you're counting spaces and that kind of thing. I kind of gave that part up.
Mm-hmm.
But some of that is, one is like Theater of the Minds, you can still have a conversation about what characters want to do and what the players want to do and how to accomplish that. So you're you kind of have this baseline of here are the things on the map, here's roughly what's closer to what. And so you're not spending that time describing what's there, but at the same time, you want to make sure to give people options where if the thing they want to do is, can I get all the way to the other side of this guy? While it may look like if you were strictly counting squares, that would be too far, but you might be able to work with the player to come up with a way to make that happen.
Yeah, no one wants to be the dwarf that made 25 feet and is 5 feet away from the bad guy. And you're like, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of these rabbit holes we can talk about is D&D's use of
5 foot
precise
movement.
distances.
Yep.
Yeah, well, and also spell ranges and stuff, which
Yep.
this is one of my things. I don't know if this is a tip so much, just kind of general context. So I have this thing where I cannot visualize relational spaces in my head, right? So the biggest example I like to give is if I'm playing a video game like Dragon Age and
Mm-hmm.
I'm walking down a corridor and I get into a fight and then the fight's over and I'm trying to like continue down the corridor, I have no way which way I came from because I get completely spinned around and and I can't keep track of what's in relation to what. and often I'll just end up walking back a ways before I realize, oh wait, this is the door I came in, and I have to like trek back, and that happens constantly, right? And that's one of the things I always struggle with in theater of the mind is, I don't have that picture that a lot of other people do in their heads when describing stuff, and this leads to a few other knock-on effects. So, one of the things I like about my style is, with some kind of representation of what's close to where, is I at least have a baseline going in, and, when it's other people's turns, I can track like, oh, that person went over there or isn't in the room anymore. That monster went away, because I can quickly glance without having to try and retain that information, which just doesn't work for me. And so this is one of those things where it's kind of an accessibility issue. So I guess to try and turn it into a tip is to understand your players, not just their preference, but like what they can handle. And not everybody can necessarily put their finger on what the issue is. Sometimes they'll just kind of check out.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
So if it's something where they get confused more often, it might be that the player just, can't keep up with the specific style, and some tweaks have to be made.
Right. Got it. Yeah, those are really good. So yeah, and we'll talk more about that, because I think right there, this is it's really nice. I think it's really awesome that we have as many different options for this as we do, and I think we can pick one nice thing. And I know you and I talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the topics for the show, is that it's not all or nothing. Like you don't have to say like, this is going to be, a gridded game, or we're doing grids for every battle. And sorry, I know we want to have like, there's one guard who's smoking, whose back is to you, but we're setting up a map and I'm putting that guard, and he's, so there's, you can try it, right? You can try different things at different times and be like, oh, that didn't work, and then never do it again. Right.
Right.
So,
well, and like your example, different scenes call for different things, where you can just say, well, you're going to jump the guard. We're just going to
if I say a
few quick rolls about that.
Yeah, there's 3 Medusa mages at the northern, eastern, and southern altars. At the western altar is your villain Leto Skal. Nearby him is his assassin bodyguard Valentine. In the center is a huge podium of fire. Coming out of the podium is a massive beast called Entropy. What do you want to do?
Right. Oh, and by the way, every round D6 skeletons enter from the south.
Right. That was a real battle, by the way.
Yeah.
And I ran it on a grid because I was like, this is too complicated. So, so I wrote the question, and then I'm going to waffle on the question of preferred style, but I'm going to defend pure theater of the mind because it was a different style for me. And I'm also defending because I think it is a valuable style that is underused. Even recognizing, some of the accessibility things that you mentioned, because I think it can be used in those circumstances of like, there's a guard down the hall, his back is to you. What do you want to do? You don't need to set up a grid for like, I run up and jack him, So, but when I run theater of the mind, 3 things. I think these tips that I have, you can actually use for pretty much any style, maybe other than pure gridded. I think, but probably maybe you can use these in all of them. And my 3 are, number 1 is ask for the intent. So what does when a player, a lot of times I'll have this back and forth with a player of like, how far away are the 2 guards? And you're like, they're 25 feet away. And it's like, how close are they to one another? And you're like, 15 feet. And they're like, is there anything? And you're like, what do you want to do? Right? I want to cast Eldritch Blast on 2 guys. I'm like, no problem. Like, why are we having this big conversation? You can Eldritch Blast both the guys. So one is like, what do you, short-circuiting the conversation of what do you want your character to accomplish? Like, what are you trying to do? And then work with them to try to do it. Right. So you're not asking them so that you can screw them. You're asking them because you want to say, yes, absolutely. How many can I, how close are the goblins together? What do you want to do? I want to fireball them. You can hit all of them with a fireball. Right. So one is ask for intent. 2 is err in favor of the character. So if you are in a circumstance where it's arguable about one thing or the other, go with the character's intent, right? And go in the, if the character is like, if I move away, will I take an OA? Only if you've explicitly stated, like only if it's very clear that they would have been, like they were just fighting a guy, would you say, yes, you're going to take an OA? Otherwise you say, no, your character is smarter than we are. They did not put themselves in a position to take an opportunity attack. So you err in favor of the character. And that also means sometimes erring against your monsters. So if the monster's running around, you say, you get a free OA, right? Oh, I didn't even know they were near me. Yeah, they are. They walk right by you. Oh, I'll hit them. So that can work. And then third is, especially when you're in a pure theater of the mind, start and end with big fiction, right? So we have this opportunity in theater of the mind to do things that you can't do on a 2D grid. If we use that, like you are hanging from a rope, we had this happen, right? Airship is flying over this area. You're hanging from a rope that, you're swinging back and forth, but you think you can just swing within range of the two knolls that are on the edge of the other airship that's nearby. What do you do? And they're like, oh, I'm going to wait and swing at a sword. Okay. Then we figure out the mechanics. And then we describe, you hit the knoll comes flying off and tumbles down 1,000 feet to the mountains below. So you have these like big fictional things that you aren't going to show up on a grid. But really turn what is otherwise, like we were talking about, a bunch of spreadsheet work, rolling dice and coming up with numbers and checking other things. It turns that into, high and powerful fiction.
Yeah, to go back to your first example of, like how far apart are the guards? Can I shoot them both kind of thing? The common ground here is we shouldn't have to be doing trigonometry to be playing D&D, right?
Yeah.
Really, and this is one of the things that bugs me about D&D that a lot of other RPGs just don't have because of, stuff that is in those core rules, where it's like, I have these powers that I've harnessed from eldritch gods and sold my soul to. They move exactly 15 feet and then sputter out. And,
right.
Yeah. So, like, it takes all these things that really should be more narrative and more interesting,
right,
and boils them down to, like, here's these very specific numbers behind them. And, the kind of, like, bad version of theater in the mind is, the DM has all those distances in his head and is like, no, you are out of range, but
right.
you can't see it, right?
Yeah, it's really easy to suck at theater of the mind, right? Yeah. And it's probably pretty easy to suck at D&D, period. And God knows I've played gridded games with DMs where it didn't, being on the grid did not help it. Like I was still pretty miserable.
Yeah. I guess my defense of the grid would be if you're just getting started and kind of still getting comfortable with things, it's fine to treat it like a board game, just to be like, okay, here's a map that I've bought from somewhere, or comes in the starter kit or whatever, and we're going to play this out on.
The interesting bit, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Neither the starter kit nor the essentials kit come with any kind of gridded They have no tokens. They have no gridded maps.
Right.
So I think I think that I don't have the data on hand, but I know I've done it, and I know that by far the majority of D&D DMs that I was able to poll on Twitter, which was in the hundreds to perhaps thousands, was they almost all exclusively used the grid. It was heavy on the grid and very little on theater of mind. And I think that's why I hang on to it so much, is that I feel like it's an underused tool, right?
Sure.
I don't feel like everybody should dump all of their, like, I'm going to go sell all my minis in Dwarven Forge, and I'm going to.
If you want to do that, let me know first.
Yeah, you send a U-Haul my way, and I'll just fill up the back. So, although I have a funny story about somebody who did have a 5-gallon drum of miniatures from all of the miniatures that Wizards and WizKids had ever produced, and gave them all away.
Wow.
That person, Chris Perkins. So, and then we'll talk about that, because that to me is a really interesting topic. That's something I was talking about with Enrique. So one of the big questions I have for you, because I think this is an area where you have more experience than I have. But if we were to make those 4 buckets of gridded play, abstract map, and we can sort of describe what these mean, but you know what I mean. Relative distances like 13th Age has, and pure theater of the mind. Are there other combat styles you've seen in RPGs that are outside of those?
Those are the main ones that I know of, and part of that is because, as I said, like D&D and kind of offshoots of D&D really have a lot of their previous editions baked into them, where a fireball is a 30-foot sphere, right? And it says that in the rules of like every edition to some extent. Where a lot of these other games that aren't built on that at all don't need to know those kinds of specificity. They don't have rules about like, flanking, whether it's optional or not.
Right.
These rules just don't exist.
Right.
So it doesn't matter as much, and when you sneak up behind somebody and stab them in the back, it's like more of a rare thing than, the rogue's go-to move is to stab people when they're otherwise distracted.
Yeah.
So a lot of other games just don't need these tools in the same way because the players don't care as much.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I've never seen anybody complain about not having a grid when they're playing Gumshoe.
Right.
Right. Like if they're playing Knights Black Agents, nobody's whipping out miniatures and putting out a big battle map.
Yeah. What I actually find interesting about some of those games and compared to D&D is, we think of gridded as the like most tactical experience,
mm-hmm.
right? And that's true if you think of tactical as in like, looking at it from a more game-like perspective where, you know exactly how many squares you can move or how many feet you can move and how far your spells go and this, that, and the other. But that actually takes away from like things you would think of as real tactics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the guys who are ducking behind cover and laying covering fire
right.
while I'm going around the side. Like that doesn't happen nearly as much in D&D because the rules just don't support it. That's not the kind of tactics that exist there.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at other games, like those things are more emphasized as good things to do because that's the kind of tactical mindset it wants you into.
Right. So one of the things, I guess you just to help everybody sort of stay on the same page, we can define, I think it probably helps to sort of define those 4 buckets. And then, I think most stuff fits in. So obviously when we're talking about gridded play, we're primarily talking about 5-foot squares, some kind of 2-dimensional representation, a battle map or online with like Roll20 or something like that. Tokens or miniatures that fit within those 5-foot squares that represent each of the actors in the game, each of the characters in the game, and stuff like that, and all of the distances that we have in something like D&D, whether it was 3rd, 4th, or 5th, all is either measured in like a 5-foot distance, limited 5-foot distance, or in 4th edition's case was actually measured by squares, right?
Or yards randomly in there.
Yeah, every so often you get yards, right? That makes my head hurt.
Yes,
Robert Schwab, why? So then on the other side, pure theater of the mind is just descriptive, right? That you don't have any representation, and you are just describing what's going on, and it kind of fits the same interaction that all the rest of the game fits, where you describe the situation, player describes what they want to do, you determine if there's rolling necessary, rolls are made, checks are checked, and then the results are described. DM usually describes the results, and then you sort of keep in that cycle every round for things. Then we have things like the abstract map, which actually I think, your description of how you play sounds like it's leaning on the left side of the abstract map closer to gridded combat than, say, Fate. Right. Where Fate has a zone and the zones could be arbitrarily big. Right.
The zones just care about, like, it gives you some sense of, the important scenes and where people are within those scenes, but it's not as much about distance. But you also have things where like a range attack goes one zone over.
Right.
And it's also about defining the environment. So like this zone is the lava pit and next to that is, the fountain and whatever. And
yeah. And in Fate, a zone will have a descriptor, right? An aspect, and the aspect can be triggered. An aspect can be triggered by character things in order to do something. So if it's a lava pit, it's like I'm gonna use my magic to draw a pillar of lava out of the lava pit and smack the giant in the face with it, right? And then you're sort of invoking the aspect of the zone.
Right, and in that way, it's closer to theater of the mind, I would say. Like because generally. Where people are in these different kind of sub-environments.
Right.
But still the more nitty-gritty when things are together is more descriptive and more general and more imaginative.
I don't know if Fate still, I can't remember if Fate Condensed describes it this way, but I know that people had done this where they would take 3x5 cards and they would write the name of the zone and the aspects of the zone on a 3x5 card and set those out. So you could kind of see like, oh, okay, this is what these 3 areas look like when they're combined. Right. I used to joke that it's gridded play, but the grids are 50 feet wide, right? Like it's a grid. They're just huge. So then the other side, and I don't know a lot of games that do this, but maybe you know more than I do, where they use relative distances to describe things. It's pretty popular. And it's the idea that you have like things that are adjacent to you, things that are close by, things that are medium, or things that are far, or things that are grouped, right? And the game that I know that does this the most is 13th Age, which is referred to as the love letter to D&D. Rob Hainsel from 4th edition and Jonathan Tweet from 3rd edition put this game together after 4th edition had sort of imploded and made this new game. And it is completely built on this abstract distances. So all the spells and things will say like Fireball says you can hit 1d3 grouped enemies or 1d6 if you're willing to have an ally in the group. Right.
And I really like that approach. That's probably the closest to my approach when running D&D. I genuinely do miss in D&D I probably haven't done this since 2nd edition, the fireballs that were genuinely dangerous when you were throwing them around. Because
they would morph around hallways and stuff, and
it was just it's fire, right?
Volume was a problem. Yeah,
it would just expand, to fill some of the space,
right.
And you get into 3rd edition where you can specifically say, well, I'm targeting this specific point in this specific radius, and also I have the meta magic feat to ignore that square in it,
right.
And like that's basically persisted since 3rd edition through the current edition, where
it's just
you basically you just never.
I think like reflecting lightning bolts too was a thing, right? Like in 2nd edition. And the only time that ever came up was when I was playing like the old AD&D gold box games, and I'd have some jackass character in a hallway, and the lightning bolt would go bouncing back and forth and hit him 4 times.
Yeah, or the first time it like comes back to you, and you're like,
"Oh no, why?" Yeah. Right?
Yeah, that kind of stuff I really do miss. Like it just feels more magical to me, and part of what I've done when running D&D with those spells is that I tell people, well, you can hit these 2 guys safely, or you can hit twice that number.
The deal, right? The art of the deal.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think so. I think I heard Rob Hainsel first refer to that like as making deals, right? And it was always like, sure, you could, you could hit 4 of them if you're willing to put 1 ally, and it's great. And a lot of times the ally's like, yeah, I'm good with that. Like, go ahead. I think when I was running my one-on-one game with Enrique, my favorite moment in that game was when his sidekick was like, I could, you're surrounded by dudes, I could throw a fireball. And he's like, go ahead and do it. And he throws it right at his head and blew him and killed everybody around him. So much fun. Yeah. So it's funny. You kind of bring up that like we think of gridded play as the more tactical option, but like I regularly now use the Z axis in my descriptions. So like one of my general rules is like, if you have an area spell, you can almost always hit 1 target without worrying about anyone else, because it's a sphere. So you can put it right up above their head. So only their head is included in the bottom of the sphere, and it's up above everyone else. And people are like, but it's a fireball. It's like, it's okay. Right. Like there's lots of angles, and it really gets fun when you're talking about beholders and their eye ray and how they can manipulate the eye ray, or a dragon's cone breath. Right.
Yeah. The cones are another area where it's like, that's a very concrete thing that's you have to abstract or make a very, very specific, like, well, it's dragon's breath. It always, it's a funnel shape always,
Yeah, right. It's like, no, I can pretty much turn a cone into anything from a circle to a line by the angle and direction that I choose. It's one of the interesting things whenever I kind of, get fired up and talk about this on Twitter. A couple of times I've had people who were like, there is no abstract combat in 5th edition. It is a gridded game. And I'm like, tell me how a fireball fits into that. Because a fireball is a circle, and circles don't fit on a grid. Right? And they're like, templates. And I'm like, that? No, templates are not. It's described as radius, right? Like these are circles we're dealing with. So it always, it always kind of brings it up. And I think, so your description of like, D&D picked something. They picked 5-foot square resolution on their, and I had a chance to talk to Jeremy Crawford about this. I think when we were talking about monsters or something, but it came up, and he had a pretty good argument, which was if you were going to pick one aspect to do it, the only way that you could support both narrative combat and gridded combat with one set of distances was to do something like a 5-foot resolution. Because if you think about 13th Age, there is no way to go back to a grid on 13th Age, right? There's no way to go. You could do it on a grid, but you're still using all those abstract distances. There's no way to reverse engineer a fireball back into a 30-foot radius. It doesn't have, or 20,
Right.
you know, yeah. So
Sure.
so his argument was, if what they tried to do, and they tried to do a lot of things. They tried to do encounter balance, and that
Right.
didn't work out. So sometimes things don't work out quite as well as we want. Although, well, I'll come back to that in a sec. So yeah, so the argument was, if you use 5-foot distances that aren't squares, so it's not 4th edition, and you ensure that, generally speaking, you don't have any powers that really require something described in a spatial line. So if you look at like a rogue and backstab, the rogue's backstab does not say you have to be in the opposite side of a creature. It just says you have to be next to a creature that has an ally. You have to be next to a creature that has an ally near it, and then you can get backstab, right? There's a lot of areas where they talk about it in somewhat abstract terms, even though it's still like in a 5-foot area.
So remind me, are there still races that have different speeds?
Yes. Yep. So there's still, yeah, right.
That's part of where this breaks down for me, because like playing on a gridded game, like halflings are at a very real mechanical disadvantage that just kind of goes away when you move to other styles.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And like I think those rules are, like, I'm not in favor of them existing altogether.
Right.
But it's one thing that you are basically dropping from your rule sets to move to this other mode, which, it's fine, do what's best for your game, but at the same time, like, if it's going to be baked into the game that way, but you can be, like, if you're wishy-washy about it and you're like, well, halflings can only run 20 feet, but if you're running Theater of the Mind and it doesn't matter,
right.
But it really is a concrete difference, right? Like, there are class abilities that give you more speed. There's spells that do that kind of thing. And so I think it breaks, like, I wish they had gone a little bit more into the, either choose a side or provide better guidelines all around. Or
so that to me is the biggest failing. That if you look at, and here's I mean, not to just bag on WotC, but we'll have bag on WotC time, right? It's half an hour into the show, we get 5 minutes to bag on WotC. Sure. And one of the the interesting bit of weird cyclic problems here is that there's, I think, 3 paragraphs of text in the Dungeon Master's Guide that is there to help people run Theater of the Mind. And it's the descriptions of targets in an area of effect. It's the only thing they have there. And in between the DMG and Xanathar's guide, there's like 30 pages about how to figure out how to do grid stuff, including a bunch of goofy things about, like, here's how to line up dice in order to figure out what a fireball looks like. And you're like, who has like 36? I mean, I know you do, but who has like 36 D6 lying around, right? That they're going to use in order to build a fireball template. So there's so many pages spent on different options to do gridded play. It's got facing rules. It's got hex rules. It's got all these different sort of options. And yet it only has 3 paragraphs of, I know everybody in chat's like, I have that many dice. I know you do. I know if you're here, you probably have plenty of D6s. So there's so many options, and yet they only have 3 paragraphs. But here's the thing that really is weird. According to Crawford, everybody at WotC plays with Theater of the Mind now. And when I talked earlier about, Chris Perkins giving away a 5-gallon drum of miniatures, that's because he plays in Theater of the Mind. And if you look at their examples of gameplay on YouTube and all the shows that they do and everything like that, it's all Theater of the Mind. And yet they don't offer any guidance to help people run Theater of the Mind. So I think probably you and I think you agree. I think I'm agreeing with what you had said before, which is like, help a dude out, right? Like, give us.
Well, I think the argument cuts in both directions too. So, there's the book The Monsters Know What They're Doing that gives you the tactical advice, and it's a great book. Yeah. But it's not written by WotC, but it's like considered by so many to be this essential thing of like getting, knowledge of monster tactics and how to run them effectively, right? Yeah. Yep. And like that's not anywhere in the books either. Nope. That's like you get the sentence of like kobolds like to gang up or whatever, but it's not really giving you actionable table advice. So, but the rules that they put in the book, that they're giving you more stuff on, are pushing you towards that style.
Right.
And
Yeah,
they're not
and
going to give you the tools.
shameless plug. I on the previous DM's deep dive had Keith Ammann, the author of Monsters Know What They're Doing, on the show, where we talk specifically about monster tactics. And what I really thought was an interesting way that he handled it, which is he's also talking about the fiction. So I love how, in that book, how he talks about the attributes that a monster has and what that means about how the monster behaves in the world. So it's even more than just like the nitty gritty of like, how to have your kobolds gank a dude. It was, it really got into like how they would act given the stats that they've got, which I thought was it's an important thing that DMs can learn. But yeah, I mean, so like I've now written, I think, 4 variants of guidelines for to try to help people run Theater of the Mind combat, because again, not because I think I'm going to get everybody to switch over from the grid or it's my preferred style of play, because again, mountain of Dwarven Forge upstairs. But I love to have all these ranges, right? I love as a DM, I want every tool I can get to help me tell a story. And there are many times where I'd prefer to tell a story where combat is a quick thing. We just describe it. We don't drop to a grid. We don't need all the complicated play, and it can move and cycle very quickly and then go back to aspects of the story that aren't combat. Just like I want to be able to run 1,000 skeletons in a battle, right? And it's like, I'm not pulling out I don't have 1,000. I have a lot of minis. I don't have 1,000 skeleton minis, but I have some nice and easy rules. Yeah, right. I got to go buy more skeletons. I'm sure Reaper's got a Kickstarter I can get into.
Probably.
So, but so I want tools to help me run lots and lots of monsters. I want tools to help me be able to balance an encounter quickly, or not balance it, but recognize, am I going to kill them all? Right? Is this battle overdone? Or is it on par with what I expect? And a lot of these, like, the game doesn't have, I picked those 3 because those are like my 3 big bugaboos. But the community can kind of jump in and fill in these. And I think they have, like, Monsters Know What They're Doing. And it's frustrating because you're like, where the hell's WotC in all of this, right?
I know, that's my main point.
Right,
and,
like, yeah.
Decisions were made to go these directions, but then not support them enough.
Yeah,
and,
I mean... Yeah.
And one thing they didn't predict was the rise of all the actual play, Twitch shows and whatnot.
Sure. But like Tasha's just came out. So we have a book that's 50% DM stuff, supposedly. It's like a lot of DM stuff. And I got 12 pages of puzzles.
Yeah.
But I got no one page to help me out with running Theater of the Mind combat, which they're all doing. And I think it's like, yeah, I've had this conversation with other people at WotC too, and they're like, well, what do you want us to say? Because there's so many different ways, like what, and you're like, well, you pick sides with these other things.
Right.
So
and that's the thing, like,
you can say.
D&D is so many people's first game.
Right.
And especially now, more people are trying to get into it.
Yeah.
But you're just kind of hanging them out to dry. And that's like the stuff that is obvious to us, that what do you want us to say is like, here's the basics, and I know you've written a bunch of articles about it. Like, this show is an attempt to kind of get there, but it's
but I can only reach who I can reach, and there's 20 million players out there.
They put out like a player's handbook tailored towards people who have seen nothing but Critical Role, and it takes out a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, the other thing I think our bagging 5 minutes is over, but the other thing is, like, I mean, the Dungeon Master's Guide in general is a pretty poor way to tell people how to run their games. Like, I'm like, seriously, you're going to start with the planes of existence and the gods, like that? Not helping me make an adventure, right? Like, I got people coming over at 8:00 tonight. I could really use some help, and I'm like, well, I'll write a book about that, right? Like, I'll try to help. I'll try to help some people out. So, like, oh man, we just got a big party. A bunch of people just showed up in our Twitch chat. So, let's see. I totally jumped off the thing.
We had our rant time.
Oh, we had our rant time. So, yeah. So I guess how can we use the other styles of play? We've talked about Theater of the Mind a lot, and we've talked about gridded play a lot. But like, when we talk about, so you said when you run 5e, you run it more abstract, right? A little bit. Like, you're not quite concerned about squares.
Yeah. And I have tons of poster maps from years of D&D that I still love using, right? And they actually help me plan adventures.
Right. Your tip about start with a map, right, was a tip that I've hung on to. If you're having trouble with inspiration on how your adventure is going to go, grab a battle map and build something around it. It's a fine way to go.
I don't want to get bogged down in counting squares or discouraging people from a thing they want to do.
Sure.
So, I run it more loosely like, okay, this area generally you can get to within a move action.
Hmm.
This far away would take your whole turn, or you can use range attacks and like set the scene that way. And then, people might cluster up as people attack
Hmm.
one another. I can put the minis next to each other. So, like you're engaged with the orc and you're, off to the side. Fine. We can see that as a whole, but I'm
Yeah.
also not worrying about the nitty gritty of counting anything. Is the
Yeah.
big.
So I guess that could be sort of a useful conversation. If we look at the four style, generally the four buckets, what would you say are sort of the advantages and disadvantages of of each bucket? So let's start with gridded play and work our way out. So what would you say are like? I mean, what are some of the advantages that come to your mind with running play on a grid?
Yeah, everyone's on the same page, right?
Hmm.
You don't have to start your turn asking a lot of the questions that you need in a lot of these other styles.
Right.
You can always just, look at the map and count for yourself. I think it's the easiest to get into, both to run and to, when you're starting to learn, or, even if you're playing in like a competitive setting of some kind,
Hmm.
you know what I mean? Like, old tournament modules and stuff, it
Hmm.
does make a certain amount of sense to do it there, where it's something that needs to be standardized. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, Yeah, and it sort of hits on other, like you're using a whole other sense, right? You're
Yeah,
using, certainly sight, but also potentially touch,
yeah.
and miniatures are pretty and fun,
I was going to say that does,
right?
probably the number one bonus is that we get to use all the cool toys we bought
Yeah,
over
right,
the years,
right.
and that's not nothing.
Yeah, well, that's right. So it's not nothing, and it
I mean,
definitely,
nowadays not so much, but
well,
when we have gaming in person,
yeah, right, right. Well, I mean, even still though, like the artwork is fun. So like I'll go out and specifically look for fun artwork for the tokens that I use when I'm doing games on a virtual tabletop, because it's like, the WotC ones are fine, but I like big face pictures that I can see
right?
easily, so I'll go and make tokens for it. Um,
I've actually been doing Hero Forge,
yeah.
yeah, designing the minis and then like taking screenshots
Oh,
and
that's cool.
pulling those out
Yeah,
because I can tell the players like go in, customize yourself, and
and then you'll make a token for it.
yeah, and then we'll just drop the token in.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Um, so it's funny because some of those advantages are also its disadvantages, right? That like if maps and minis, one of the things that has driven me crazy is like I think like you, I don't know, are you a big minis collector? I can't remember. I mean, I
Yeah,
know that one time you did take a ancient red dragon all the way on a train from Washington D.C. to Boston.
well, you'll recall also the year before that I took a backpack full of Dwarven Forge similarly.
And it was the old ceramic Dwarven Forge, right?
Yeah,
It's not the
yeah.
nice lightweight plastic stuff they're
Oh, that
making
stuff
now.
didn't exist yet. Yep,
Yeah. So, yeah. So,
yep.
like, I feel like, boy, did we get it's sort of like investing in the stock market early. Like, I got minis when they were 15, 20 cents each, right? And I have buckets and buckets of them, and now they're like $2.50 a piece.
Yeah,
So it's nearly impossible to build a reasonable collection of miniatures, and have all and still I never have all the minis. So I'm always one troll short,
right.
right? It's like I never have all the minis that I need, and I've got
I do it
thousands.
the opposite way, where I find the stuff
Yeah,
first
and then
and
like,
then customize.
mhm.
But like products are still coming out, like starter kits and whatnot, that have tokens in them, and then I'm like, but I have this pile of tokens. I like they're very nice, but I have all these minis, and then
Right.
the tokens sit in like a different drawer, and
Yeah,
they just pile up as well.
yeah, yeah. So there's a high expense that can, and it's nearly an unlimited expense when it comes to miniatures, right?
Right.
Of the collection that you can build. Like, God help you on Dwarven Forge, right?
Hmm.
Like, that has a steep curve. But yeah, I think you nailed it on the head with like there's an aspect of player and player agency that comes with gridded play that I think you lose the more abstract, the Mother May I sort of style that comes to when you have sort of either abstract distances or certainly with theater of the mind.
Right.
So if we look
And
at, yeah, go ahead.
I'll just, you know, and no amount of rules or styles is going to prevent a jerk DM from being a jerk. but at
Yeah.
least you can gloss over some of those issues if you can see what's going on and you're not negotiating all the time.
Yeah. So this is I don't know if it's a bias on my part. It's a, I certainly in my own experiences this has been true that when particularly in online play, they've had these sort of big online conventions and you could go and sign up for them. And I have found that by specifically avoiding the ones that use a VTT, I've had better games. I think to me, and again, like it's a potentially biased opinion. It's been rare when I've seen somebody run Theater of the Mind and be a jerk. Right? It's like if they've got to the point where they're running Theater of the Mind, most of the time if they have experience in it, they recognize the fact that they're working with the player to make things happen more so than they're trying to challenge them.
Yeah, I'll give one minor counterexample,
Sure.
and I don't want to throw the guy under the bus, but the DM I had in undergrad was a math professor, and he was a great DM, and I love him to bits, but he would run Theater of the Mind, and this was third edition, and he would have all the distances in his head all the time, and none of the rest of us had any clue. And he would do things like switch between feet and yards and different angles and stuff.
It's like,
and
what's the problem?
Right. Yeah, he wasn't trying to be a jerk. Right. He just, is a math professor, and that stuff came easily to him.
Yeah, I'm sure it happens, and I know that, like, again, a jerk DM who's like a tyrant rather than a facilitator. Will be bad with whatever tools they use.
Yeah.
I wonder if that'd be, worse with me, where whenever anybody asks me a distance, I say 25 feet. And they're like, wait a minute, but I've been figuring all of these things out that you've been saying. There's no way all these things can be. I'm like, it's 25 feet away. I'm like, but that other thing was also 25 feet away, and you said it's 25 feet away from this. I'm like, I don't know. They're all on a line. What do you want me to say? What distance would you like him to be? Right. So what would you say are some of the, so I think a lot of people that I've talked to, the middle ground is this idea of an abstract battle map, right? And this is like second edition, everybody did it this way. There weren't published gridded maps, right? There were Chessex yet, hadn't started coming out with wet erase battle maps yet. And for my first, third of my life playing D&D, we took out like pieces of paper and drew stuff out, right? And like, dragons here, you guys are here, what do you want to do, right? So I think it's sort of it's a good middle ground between the flexibility of Theater of the Mind and the being able to see it, right? It's that idea of like, well, we're all on a common ground because we're all looking at the same picture. What's your kind of experience with that, and what would you say are the advantages and disadvantages of sort of an abstract map?
Yeah, I mean, so start with some of the disadvantages that you can sometimes get the worst of both worlds, right? So you're still pulling out miniatures, you're still, putting stuff down for everybody to see, but you're still having to have conversations on what is permissible and what's not. Maybe not as often as pure Theater of the Minds, but definitely more often than pure gridded. So you still get those speed bumps occasionally in the flow of it. But the advantages for me is, I get to use all my cool toys. I get to avoid some of these arguments by just having everything laid out in front of everyone. And again, for me, because I can't keep a lot of these things in my head, as a DM, it's like I need to be able to present a consistent picture to my players, and that's the best way that I can do that. And so it's even if my players were super good at it, which always players are to various extents have skills or not in that area. It's a way for all of us to like get on the same page as far as, how close these particular things are.
Yeah. So you said that, and some of the what would some of the disadvantages of that be? Yeah, I guess you said them, that like you're still arguing about some of the nitty gritty details, right? And like how big is my fireball on this abstract map? And are these guys in it? Yeah.
Stuff like that with the fireball. I think is more where it ends up being a problem, where there are these spells that you're used to from previous editions or video games or whatever, looking and acting a particular way, and then you kind of have to pull out to that middle distance of, well, we know from the description of the spell it goes 150 feet. So,
Right.
it can reach up to somewhere around here, but then figuring out exactly who's in the blast and who's not, everyone's always going to be like, well, I pointed over here. So it only gets those two
Yeah.
bad guys. And, you still get that. And, you know, me as a DM, I might want to say, but you could maybe get more and,
Right.
put that danger back in it or, introduce some other kind of complication, but you just can't do that in the same way. Right.
Right. Right. Right. Yeah, I've definitely seen people overlay the grid back on top of an abstract map, right? Where
Yeah.
they're right. You sort of have it, and you're like, don't I've said it, like, don't worry about it. Particularly, God help you if you have a map that has a grid on it, but you're like,
Right.
ignore the grid. They're like, there's
Right.
no way they're going to be able to ignore the grid, right?
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah.
another disadvantage for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of times recently, I've been grabbing like Dyson logo maps, and I'll throw them in as a VTT, and they often have 10-foot squares. So I'm like, all these squares are 10 feet, and everyone's like, I can't, like, my head's breaking.
Carry
Right?
the one and divide
Yeah,
by
like you
two.
can only move 3 squares. You can't move 6 squares, and
Right.
yeah. So I've seen people where like they can't quite, when you have a map, they start to affix specific distances, even though that doesn't work in an abstract map as well. One thing I love about abstract maps is one reason why I love D&D overall, is that it can cost anywhere from basically 0 to as much as you want to spend. Right. So you can get like a 3x5 card and a pencil you stole at the dog track, and you can, draw out your whole map on there of you're fighting Tiamat, the goddess of dragons. She's here. You guys are over here. 25 evil wizards are over here. Right. And you can draw out these incredible battles on like with just a pencil and a piece of paper. Right. Or
Well,
you can,
you
yeah, right. Or you can, cash out your 20-year 401k and buy literally $100,000 of stuff, right? And build out and get a massive gaming table and build these like 4-foot high 10-foot long battle dioramas with every
Right.
miniature on it, and it can still be the same general rules, right? It's still the abstraction can still be there. So yeah, I think that I think the abstract battle map is probably my preferred of the various styles because of that,
So
right?
we've actually come to consensus. We started on opposite ends and kind of
I
bumped
have
in
a
the middle.
feeling we were in the middle all along.
Okay,
It's the
fine.
friends we've made along the way.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, I think so one of the things that I have that I started doing, because I had to learn how to play online like a lot of people, and I never really had, and I went from 0 to 100 at,
Yep.
in a week, literally in a week. I had to I don't know. And I've fallen in love with Discord as my platform to run games, and I'm not a big fan of the heavier VTTs. So lots of people love Roll20. Lots of people love Fantasy Grounds. Lots of people love what's the one that's got everybody's attention these days? Foundry. So some big ones. I have a one that I've fallen in love with called Owlbear Rodeo. I don't know. Have you seen Owlbear Rodeo?
I've looked at it briefly.
I
Yeah.
love Owlbear Rodeo. So the thing I love is like there's no accounts. There's no login. You just fire up a map. It's got no mechanic connection to it. So you do all your mechanics in another system, and you just
Yep.
move tokens around on a map. And it has a bunch of default tokens, which means if you need to set up something right now, you can just do it, right? You don't need
I've been using one that sounds similar, and it's actually a business tool that started to be repurposed for gaming. It's called Miro, Miro.
I've heard of it. I haven't tried it.
It's like a big business whiteboarding system that you can share with any number of people, right?
Yeah.
And the person who introduced me is Rob Donahue, who's the master
Sure.
of
Oh, yeah.
taking business stuff and turning it
Yeah.
into gaming.
Yeah.
But it's really good for it because you can drop in, because it's like this massive space. You can just zoom in and zoom out. So you can drop the character sheets directly on, so they're all right there.
Yeah.
You can drop whatever map you want. You can drop images in to make the tokens. There's even little widgets, like I actually put a dice roller thing in it for when people need it, or just roll to the side. And also you've got tables, so I can like sort the initiative from
Yeah, that's cool.
the table that's in there,
Yeah.
and it's all shared among everybody. So
Yeah.
you can also, the owner of the account can lock things down so people aren't like dragging things accidentally. And that kind of thing.
Yeah, we have a lot of that. I've
Yeah,
had the
exactly.
accidental player come and delete every object that I drew because it's one button to delete everything, and I'm like, where did it all go?
Nope.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
But yeah, so I've been primarily playing with sort of, probably the most abstract of abstract maps you can have, which is like a text list pasted into the text chat of Discord that has, I think of it like a like Darkest Dungeon. If you ever played Darkest Dungeon, you got 4 guys on the left, you got 4 guys on the right, and there's a one-dimensional map, right? There's no spatial play, but you can see like who's close to who and who's far away. And so I'm doing that, but it's top to bottom. And it's like, if you have 2 names that are right next to each other, that means they're adjacent. If there's a space, that means there's space. If there's dash, 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 that means it's like 25 feet.
Right.
And so it has that sort of Fate style zone aspect. And it has worked pretty well. It gives just, it's like the bare minimum of a visual representation. But it's something that my wife and I came up with after thinking about how we could do more combat in Theater of the Mind, but offer something, that was still just pure Discord without having to go to a third-party tool at all. And so that's what we did. But then Owlbear has made it so fast for me to set things up that I've been doing a little bit more Owlbear. But I still like the text-based, that I call it like a text-based combat tracker, right? But it is like the most abstract you can get.
It's like a roguelike.
Yeah,
D&D.
right. That's exactly, which is to me great, right? Because I'll say another interest, something that I've said before, and I've done, a little tiny bit of sciencey kind of stuff, mostly asking my wife, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like tonight's game? And it was how much of my, so this is really just a model of how my wife likes games, but I've asked other people too, and I think it's pretty clear, which is the difference between a really, really nice combat display and a really, really bad one has maybe a 5 to 10% effect on the enjoyment of the game overall. That, it's a good games are generally good games, regardless of what kind of map was used or how high quality the map was. Right. And my favorite example is like I think it's probably the second worst game now because I had another bad one, but like one of my worst games I ever ran had like my biggest Dwarven Forge setup that I've ever set up, certainly in the last couple of years, and people hated the game. And it wasn't because of the Dwarven Forge, it was because like it was just downer after downer after downer, get hit by specters and falling into traps and getting their asses kicked in rooms, and they're like the layout didn't make any sense, and they're like this, they're like this sucked, and
well, so I do think that points to though maybe using some of these things sparingly, right? Or it's really an extension of the right tool for the right situation,
right tool for the right job. Yeah.
So I don't have nearly as much Dwarven Forge as you do. But, I've done big set pieces like, not touching it at all for several games, but then the like climactic dungeon is the one where the Dwarven Forge comes out, right? And so it's more memorable. It, stays more, and even if like the combat's leading up to that or the way you get through the dungeon is all Theater of the Mind or what have you, then the final room, it's like, okay, now it's serious, and that's
sure. Yeah, it's great. And I still love doing, great big Dwarven Forge setups for boss fights and stuff like that. It's fun. I even ran Dwarven Forge remote, by taking pictures and putting a camera over it. I haven't done it recently, but I did it at least once where we built the big display and then kind of shine lights on it, and that's fun. And it's still a lot of like, hey, can you move me 2 squares? No. Over to the left. No. The other left. No. Yeah. Like,
We need to get like cell phones that have like a stand, and then we can just drop it into the dungeon and like
it moves around. So there's another I think it's I don't know if I guess it's a VTT company, but there's like a board game / RPG virtual conference thing where players can zoom in. They can zoom in onto a particular part that they want from the camera that's showing.
That's Vorpal board, right?
Is that Vorpal board, right. Yep. And they can even point at stuff, right? They can even have a little pointer and be like over here, and that way you can be like, that's where it goes. So I haven't tried that out, but I know the Dwarven Forge people have used that for some of their online games when they were stuck. We have a question. Do you think making a map can hinder spontaneous building on the fly? Like if you want to generate a door that led to where where they could bypass a region that was on a time crunch. So do you think that having sort of a pre-built map hurts the spontaneity or your ability to improvise when you're running a game? What do you think?
Yeah, it can. Part of it depends on your own strengths and weaknesses as a GM. So like I can't draw like anything
Hmm.
really. I will often just tell my play like one of my players, especially Danny the architect, to draw the room for me and give him rough dimensions and whatnot.
Right.
Because it's going to be like a squiggly mess if I do it. So like, yeah, I might be giving up a little bit in terms of, well, I can add the secret door here, but I generally think, to some extent, you want people to have engaged their imaginations even when it's on a map, and to be able to say like, well, this here, like, you remove the rock and there's a spiral staircase down.
Hmm.
Like, I don't have to put out on the map an actual thing that represents it, or at worst, I can put like a generic colored marker to say that's what that is, right? So
Right.
I think you can still have that kind of effect, just maybe not as a wider scale as you might want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've run into circumstances where like I'll use a map and I'll grab I'm a huge fan of Dyson logos now because it's like I never have to draw a map again. There's 1,000 different maps on that site, and I'm pretty sure if I have an idea for something, he's had it already. And but every so often I'll have it where like there's some kind of element in the room that's not on the map, but I know is there. And boy, it confuses you. You're like, no, in that corner is this thing, and like, but it's not there. No, trust me, it's there.
Right.
Or like I had one. I think the worst one I did was like they were like, "Is that a secret door in the lower right?" I'm like, "Nope, there's nothing there." And then later, like the monsters use the secret door, and they're like, "You told us it wasn't a secret." I'm like, "I lied," you know. And so, so there have been times where like yeah,
Again, no amount of rules can prevent a jerk DM.
exactly. All right, a perfect example of the can't help a bad DM. So we only touched on it a little bit. Do we want to talk about and maybe again, if there are other games that use it, the 13th Age style of abstract distances? So it's not really zone based. It's more of this close, adjacent, close, medium, far, and grouped and stuff like that. Have you seen other systems that use that?
No, that's another one that comes to mind. I mean, there are others that
I think
kind of
Numenera.
play
I
in
think
that
Numenera
space.
does it. I think the Cipher system uses that too.
Yeah, I don't know of any others that's strongly lean on as much. What what really makes it in 13th Age that um, it's only partially portable to something like D&D is the thing where the spells are
Yeah.
written that way from the ground up. So, like you were saying, you can't like reverse engineer stuff
Hmm.
necessarily on the fly, for how many targets. Although, I don't know, that might make an interesting article to write up how you
Yeah.
change D&D spells to operate in that fashion.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think yeah, right. So you can't, I've never had anybody try to deconstruct it, right? When I ran a lot of 13th Age for a while, and I used battle maps and I used Dwarven Forge and all kinds of stuff. And I never had, the only time it was confusing was sort of the same thing we were talking about where they would say like, are these guys all considered grouped? Or is that
Yeah.
considered, the weird bit that I had is that the distances they are dependent upon the actor. So if you have a guy that's one place and you say, well, that guy's far, is he far from everybody or is he only far from that person? And he's actually now far from this person, but close to this person. And you get all these sort of like the distances are actually changing as the actors are moving back and forth, right?
Mhm.
Things that weren't grouped suddenly become grouped. And there was a couple with 13th Age, there were a couple of distances that were like, how do you know without having a visual description? And grouped was one of them. Like, unless you defined it or you didn't, it was hard to, grouped was a strange one.
Yeah.
It also had that idea of intersecting, right? Where
Yes.
where
Yeah.
you
I
would,
think
yeah,
one of the friendly parts. Yeah.
yeah, it was sort of their opportunity attack. Their way of sort of handling opportunity attacks was if a monster hadn't act. I can't remember the exact rule, but it was like if you moved by somebody, they could zip up and suddenly engage with you, right? And
Right.
it was sort of this interesting reaction event that I think was pretty unique, and I don't think is in any of the other sort of D20ish,
Mhm.
D&D ish sort of systems.
Right. And again, that's one of those things that introduces a different kind of tactics because you can do things where like the paladin can sit in front of the wizard and
Right.
you
Yeah.
can just like run arounds, which is you can do in a lot of other
Yeah.
things. It means the paladin will always be able to like intercept what's coming.
Yeah. I
But
think
again,
that
it adds a fiddly part to it though.
right. It added this whole other sort of weird thing. It's funny because I think I played 13th Age mostly with minis and maps. So I don't really know what it would have been like to run that completely vocally, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know. It was an interesting style. One of the things I think that kind of gets to is that idea of like sort of describing intent both on the player side. If the paladin says, "Hey, I'm going to try to stand," and I've had this when I've run Theater of the Mind games. If the paladin says, "I want to stand between the enemies and our wizard," right? And you're like, "Okay, that's a thing," and you're not going to be a dick and be like, "Well, they squeeze around you," right? Exactly. You say like, "No, that's what the player wanted," right? There's no good reason unless you could say to them, well, you're surrounded, so you can't block the wizard from everybody because there's a group from behind as well, right?
Right. Or they're juking left and splitting up, and which side do you want to go after?
Yeah, or one guy will come up, take a bunch of guys try to rush past you to get to them. I take an opportunity to that. Great, you did that one, but now the other ones get there, right? Mm-hmm. So there's still these options. The same is true on the monster side, where you can say things like the wizard's in the back and he's got his 3 ogres up front that are blocking you from getting there. Like the wizard had that intent too, right? And the wizard's like, I don't want to get jacked by a smiting paladin, so I've got my 3 big ogres out there, right? So yeah, that continual idea of like what is the overall intention of what's going on, more so than like the position and things like that. Like all of the actors are trying to do things. What is it they're trying to do, and making that clear.
Yeah, and again, I think this is somewhere that I wish were more supported in D&D, where, like with your example, where you have the line of ogres and you have the wizard behind, and the cool thing would be the rogue to like do some flying acrobatic flip over, and that would be awesome, right? But the thing is, the rules don't necessarily encourage you to do that kind of thing, or
they don't. And I think this is another one where I filled in the gaps for so long that it shocks me that there isn't, I'm like, no, that rule's in there. No, I made that up 5 years ago. Right. But that the constant rule, I wrote an article about this recently called Cinematic Advantage. And it was based on the idea that like I think it was roughly about half of 5e DMs that I surveyed use flanking rules. Right. And then the other half don't. And because it's an optional rule in the DMG, it's not part of the base, but it's so familiar to people that they've been putting it in there. And I argued for the fact of like, well, why, instead of flanking, why not put an idea of cinematic advantage, which is this, like, if you take a risk and you roll a check, you can get advantage because of a circumstance, right? Mm-hmm. Which is that, like, not only are you able to sort of run up to the ogre and run up his warhammer and bop him on the head and do a backward flip, but if you do so, not only can you get to the wizard, you'll have advantage, but it's a tricky ass move. So that's a DC 17 athletics check or acrobatics check for you to pull it off, right? And if you fail, you're prone in front of the ogres, right? And so you can.
It's a cool way to bring other skills in a way that doesn't necessarily you're more looking at, well, I've got all my combat stuff, but being able to bring in other skills, I think lends the whole thing to be more rich.
Yeah.
If you remember, one of my drum beats about 4E was to have combat outs, to have
right. On. Yeah. We needed them because if you didn't have a combat out, it'd be 3 a.m. before your battle's over.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
I actually feel that, like, less so, but I still feel like that's a thing in 5e.
Sure. Oh yeah.
But anything that gets those skills in the game where you can accomplish other things,
right?
As part of your actions and add more character to it, really can.
Yeah, I think the combat out kind of led me into this sort of the concept, which is like I don't think of scenes as the pillars. So like a combat scene isn't just combat. You can also have banter, and you can also be exploring, and you can also be interacting with things. And I ran a final session of an Eberron game I've been running for the past year, and holy cow, everything was happening in that. I planned a whole session just for one battle, but everything in that was happening in the battle, including like, using an arcane gate to pull away like the whole center crystal that was powering everything else, and then everything, remember the Medusas I was mentioning before? All their heads exploded because the energy that was being conducted by this crystal was, no longer there, and now it's just raw energy being shot out. So they all blew up.
Yeah. Just one of my other drum beats to this day is that combat and role playing are not opposites.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And that's that, a long time ago they were talking about like the unfortunate smash cut of the roll for initiative, right? Of like you have this whole scene and then suddenly you're doing bookkeeping,
Right.
and it's unfortunate that it doesn't kind of roll in popcorn. I think popcorn initiative is a good way to sort of get past that, right? You don't popcorn initiative. You immediately just kind of giving it, passing the ball back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of invented that for Marvel Heroic.
Yeah.
And I've used it in a few games since for some of those reasons.
Right. Yeah. So I think there are other games than these, and some of them have some real interesting ways. What are any other sort of final thoughts about this topic that you're dying to get out?
No, we covered.
Have we squeezed this one as much as we can, getting all the
I hope so.
the juices out?
And again, like we've been saying all along, none of these are like when you boot up your D&D game, you have to pick one and stick to it.
Right.
Look for opportunities. Actually, the one thing I will throw in here, and we talked briefly about the fate zones and those kinds of ideas of like these big areas. I particularly like those for like dynamic dungeon battles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because then you have multiple rooms where things are going on, and I think that often is something that gets ignored by D&D as well. Like you find the monsters in the one room and you fight them, and maybe one guy comes in from the side, but you stay in that room. But if you are more spreading things out, where like you start in this one zone, which is the dungeon room you came into, but then there's multiple things happening in different parts that are expanding from there, I think that's a good way to represent that without like having to build out a lot of map or having to like constantly just say, well, the room, 3 places to your west makes a gong noise and the one to the north is this. It's a way to do that that's fairly easy to follow up, but does those dynamic multi-area scenes pretty well.
And they can kind of be, that's the other thing, again, like I don't want my tools to limit me. And one of the things that like you could probably do that at like the multi-planier level, right? That like you could have a battle across Sigil where you're jumping from world to world to world, and like, oh, now you're in Avernus and you got to watch out for the pit fiends. Oh, now you're in, So
and you're like, well, hold on, got to set up the dungeon.
Yeah, right. You don't have to, so you could have these
for the elemental fire. Okay, you got to the water one.
Right. I did once run a battle with a grid on a map where I had half of it in Avernus and half of it was in the Prime World at the same time with a portal that you could drop through to go from one to the other. And it had 2 battle maps side by side with all these crazy fights on. That was a pretty good one. That was another finale. Yeah. I always go in for the finales.
Yeah. I think it's a good impulse.
But yeah, I think it's an important point to kind of hammer home the same thing you brought up, which is like, all of these are tools that you can use or not use as they serve the story, right? And the advantage of the only reason that like I kind of hang on to like Theater of the Mind is because it feels like there are certainly times where that can work, and that it's fast to use, and it avoids some of the problems that you have, speed being a big one, time, and it's not the end all be all. It's not the only way. But it's a good way to, it's just good to have all of these, right? And you now have this avenue of like, over here, I can do anything I want. And I can describe anything I want. Over here, I can build really good setups where the players have a lot of agency that they wouldn't otherwise have to be able to define how they're going to go about it. And we don't have to, they don't have to play Mother May I, to get the things they want to do. So like a lot of this, I feel like expands the range of tools that we have to tell, to share the stories that we share with our players. And I think that's why I like them as much as I do.
Yeah.
Dave, this has been fantastic. It's been too long since you and I, we talked last week, but I think it was years before that.
Yeah,
we just haven't run into each other in conventions and things like that. But yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate the talk. I was super excited last time when Enrique and I were like, hey, Dave Chalker's in the chat. All the 4E people are back.
Also, when I was like, I will fight you about
the
Mind.
And I'm like, do it. Like, not because I think I could beat you, because I know I'll learn something. And that's what I'm trying to do, is just constantly, always pick up new ideas. And boy, I've picked up a lot of ideas from you over the years. So My
Yeah.
games are better for all the information you've had and the friendship that we shared. So yeah, thank you very much for being on the show. I'm going to thank everybody who's been hanging out on Twitch and hanging out with us tonight. And for those of you watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast, thank you all very much. Have a great day and get out there and play some D&D.